On January 29, 2026, silver hit an all-time high, $121.64 per troy ounce. Never before in the entire history of trading had silver been worth so much. As it turns out, the main reason behind that sky-high price is simple. There just isn't enough silver in the world. Industry is consuming it faster than the mines can pull it out of the ground. That's exactly why leading financial analysts have started asking an uncomfortable question. Where did America's silver reserves go? Here's the thing. The United States once held the largest silver reserve in human history, more than 2 billion ounces, or roughly 62,000 metric tons. Loaded into railroad cars, all that silver would form a train nearly 7.5 miles long. And today, America's silver reserve stands at zero. Not a single gram left in the vaults. Americans are growing more and more concerned with one central question. If silver really is becoming the strategic metal of the 21st century, why did the United States get rid of its largest reserve right before the world would need it most? Could it have been a catastrophic mistake that today's generation will have to pay for? Few people realize it, but America didn't lose this silver, and it wasn't stolen. The country got rid of it itself, deliberately and by law. And today, that decision looks more and more like one of the government's most serious strategic blunders. And against the backdrop of a global shortage, the price of that mistake may climb even higher. To understand how these enormous silver reserves were squandered, we need to revisit a few facts from the past. In 1934, the Roosevelt administration passed a special law, the Silver Purchase Act. Its goal was to build up the nation's silver reserves and strengthen silver's role in the American monetary system. Soon, the U.S. government became the largest buyer of silver on the planet. The Treasury was granted the authority to buy the metal both from American producers and on the world market. The purchases were carried out on such a scale that their effects were felt far beyond the United States. American demand pushed world prices upward, and silver from all over the world gradually flowed into government vaults. Year after year, these reserves grew, and by the early 1960s, they reached their all-time peak. The vaults held more than 2 billion ounces of silver, about 62,000 metric tons of metal. It was the largest silver reserve ever owned by a single country. This enormous silver mountain served several purposes at once. It backed the issuance of silver certificates, supported the circulation of coins that were 90% silver, and was also held as a strategic reserve in case of war or another emergency. In the early 1960s, it seemed these reserves were all but inexhaustible. Yet it was at that very moment, when the silver mountain was the largest in history, that the process of its disappearance began. Back then, few could have imagined that within just a few decades, the United States would completely lose the largest silver reserve in human history. You'd think that with the biggest silver reserve on the planet, what could possibly go wrong? But that's exactly when something paradoxical happened, something no one saw coming. In the 1960s, industry rediscovered silver. The metal was increasingly used in photography, electronics, electrical contacts, soldering, and military equipment. That drove demand higher year after year. At the same time, the American economy needed more and more coinage. The country was booming, and vending machines, self-service laundromats, parking meters, and thousands of other devices were popping up everywhere. And to use them, you needed coins. The problem was made worse by the fact that silver mining could no longer keep up with this growing appetite. So the Treasury found itself in a tough spot. To hold the price of silver at around $1.29 an ounce, the government began selling metal from its reserves whenever the market price started climbing too high. The Kennedy administration even called on Congress to free silver from the currency reserves and use it for minting coins instead. Month after month, more and more silver had to be dumped onto the market to keep the price from shooting into the stratosphere. Reserves that had seemed all but inexhaustible only recently began to steadily shrink. By late 1961, the Kennedy administration realized the problem was becoming serious. Silver sales were reined in, and silver certificates were gradually pulled from circulation. But the process could no longer be stopped. And then came the central paradox of this whole story. By 1964, the United States faced an unexpected crisis. Ordinary silver coins began disappearing from circulation. People noticed that silver was rising in value and started setting their coins aside instead of spending them. Banks reported shortages of small change. In some regions, coin distribution had to be rationed. Vending machine operators complained about cash shortages. The crisis kept getting worse. The value of the silver inside the coins was creeping closer and closer to their face value. Americans understood. If the metal kept rising, the coin itself would be worth more than the number stamped on its face. And then what always happens in a situation like this happened. People started hoarding the good money and spending the paper. Silver coins vanished from circulation, not because they were banned, but because they had become too valuable to spend. Washington began to grasp the danger. If it kept minting silver coins, sooner or later the public would pull every last one out of circulation, and the country would lose its entire strategic silver reserve. The next decision, made by President Lyndon Johnson, became a turning point in history and changed American money forever. On July 23, 1965, he signed the Coinage Act. Dimes and quarters were no longer made of silver and were switched to a copper-nickel alloy. The half-dollar kept only part of its silver, which was later stripped out as well. The official reason was simple. The country could no longer afford to spend a precious metal on pocket change. But for our story, something else matters more. This law was an admission that silver had gone from a monetary metal to a strategic resource that was starting to run short. To preserve the monetary system, the authorities effectively gave up using silver in coins. Yet even this decision did not stop the drain on government reserves. New and far more complex challenges loomed on the horizon. After 1965, many might have thought the problem was solved. Silver had been removed from most coins, so the pressure on government reserves should have eased. But the opposite happened. Demand for the metal itself kept growing. American industry consumed ever more silver for electronics, the chemical industry, photography, and military technology. At the time, the world was in the middle of a genuine technological boom. Televisions, radios, tape recorders, telephones, and thousands of other devices contained silver in their contacts, switches, and electronic components. Industry was turning out this equipment not by the thousands, but by the millions. A similar surge was happening on the military side, where silver was used in electronics, communication systems, radar, and other high-tech gear. Silver went into the electronics of the Apollo program and into satellites. The metal that had sat in government vaults for decades was increasingly needed on the factory floor. So the government kept selling metal from its vaults to meet this demand and honor its old obligations to redeem silver certificates. Year after year, the silver mountain grew smaller. Whereas in the early 1960s, the government held more than 2 billion ounces of silver, by the end of the 1970s, most of that reserve was already gone. The metal wasn't stolen, and it wasn't lost. It was gradually sold to industrial companies, exchanged under government obligations, and funneled into the needs of the economy. By the early 1980s, only a small fraction of the once largest silver reserve in history remained, about 140 million ounces. What was left was transferred to the Department of Defense and given the status of a strategic reserve. Around this same time, silver found itself at the center of another sensational story. Two Texas billionaires, the Hunt brothers, tried to buy up enormous quantities of the metal and effectively corner the world's silver market. Their buying was one of the forces that sent prices soaring, and in January 1980, silver climbed to nearly $50 an ounce, the all-time record of its day. But after the exchanges and the banks stepped in, the Hunt brothers' silver empire came crashing down. And by the way, the full story of how the Hunt brothers tried to seize the world's silver market and why their scheme ended in disaster is something we'll cover in detail in an upcoming episode. You'd think, what reason could there possibly still be for the US government to spend down the silver it had left? Yet what happened next is utterly baffling. By the mid-1980s, US authorities concluded that holding silver in a strategic reserve no longer made sense. Some proposed simply selling the metal to shore up the budget. But to avoid crashing the market with one massive sell-off, Congress chose a different path. In 1986, the American Silver Eagle investment coin was introduced. The law required it to be struck specifically from government stockpile silver, and so began the quiet liquidation of the largest silver reserve in history. Year after year, millions of ounces left the vaults and were turned into investment coins for private buyers. There were no loud auctions or scandalous fire sales. The reserve simply melted away, slowly, until one day it was gone completely. As a result, by the turn of the millennium, the reserve was all but exhausted. In 2002, something happened that just a few decades earlier would have seemed impossible. The silver in the vaults of the United States ran out. A country that had once owned the largest silver reserve in human history no longer had a single gram of its own silver. To keep minting those same American Silver Eagle coins, the Treasury had to buy silver on the open market. And so ended the story of the 62,000-ton Silver Mountain. America didn't lose this reserve in a war, and it wasn't wiped out by some catastrophe. The country spent it down voluntarily, over decades, convinced that silver no longer played a strategic role. But the real climax of this story is unfolding in our own time. Silver, which in the early 1960s cost about $1 an ounce, had risen nearly 100-fold by January 2026. A reserve of 2 billion ounces would be worth roughly $243 billion. That's an enormous sum, but the real issue isn't even the money. Silver later crashed again, yet experts around the world are confident this is merely a correction against the backdrop of a looming, acute shortage. Today, silver is needed for artificial intelligence systems, data centers, solar panels, military hardware, and that same old electronics. So the United States lost not only hundreds of billions of dollars in potential value, it lost the largest strategic reserve of the metal at the very moment that metal is once again becoming one of the most sought-after and scarce resources in the world. And now, the most troubling twist of all. While America spent decades getting rid of its silver, the rest of the world was quietly stockpiling it. As of January 1, 2026, China has even restricted silver exports, holding the metal back for its own manufacturing needs. Chinese solar panel factories alone consume about a fifth of all the silver mined in the world each year. And here it's worth stopping for a moment. Silver today is no longer a piece of jewelry, a souvenir, or even coinage. It's a metal without which modern civilization simply won't run. Whoever controls silver has a hand on the throat of every high-tech industry. And the most galling part of this story is that the United States is now seriously debating whether to build a strategic silver reserve all over again. The mountain it sold off on the cheap will have to be rebuilt at today's prices. Friends, if this story grabbed you, check out our other episodes on how Roosevelt took gold away from Americans and on where America's gold disappeared to. It's all part of one big picture. And subscribe. There are many more investigations like this ahead.